Jeg vil ønske, jeg kunne tro på dig, Gud. Men her midt i togen er det svært. Svært at tro, når livet gør ondt. Når det kun er spørgsmål, der ligger nært. Hvor er du, Gud, midt i smerten? Midt i torden, blæst og regn? Når jeg beder og siger amen, men stadig står og mangler tegn. Hvordan skulle jeg kunne tro på dig, når du tillader ondskab og mørke? Hvordan skulle jeg kunne tro på dig, når alt jeg oplever kun er tørke? Og hvorfor lige netop dig, når der er 1000 religioner? Hvorfor tro på netop dig, selv efter 1000 diskussioner? Jeg er tilbøjelig til at vandre væk, Gud. Jeg mærker min apati. Tilbøjelig til at forlade dig, Gud. Jeg mærker det indeni. Og samtidig er det som om, at når jeg ser på mit alternativ, så ser det kun mere tåget ud. Skulle det virkelig give mig et bedre liv? Skal jeg selv give mit liv mening? Er jeg min egen lykkes smed? Er det ikke ufatteligt usikkert, når der er så meget, jeg ikke ved? Hvad er formålet så med mit liv? Er det hele så ikke lige meget? Karriere, status, titler og alt det andet, jeg har lejet. Og hvad så, når alt kommer til alt? Og det er døden selv, jeg skal se. Efter togen kommer der så mørke. Var det så bare det? Og hvis det handler om filosofi og videnskab, må jeg erfare, at det bare giver andre spørgsmål, som jeg nu får svært ved at besvare. Hvad med mine oplevelser med dig, når jeg blev rørt indeni? Hvordan skal jeg fortolke det? Er det så bare ren psykologi? Og hvor kommer moralen fra? Kan nogen sige, hvad der er rigtigt? Er det så ikke bare op til den enkelte, hvad man lige synes, der er vigtigt? Og hvad så med din bog? Den har jeg svært ved at komme udenom. De profetier, du har opfyldt, da du forlod himlen og kom. At historiske kilder har bevist, at det var skrevet århundreder før, hvordan Messias skulle leve, som om du har planlagt alt du gør. At disciplene var klar til at ofre sig, fordi du opstod efter 2 døgn. Der må være noget om snakken, for hvem er villig til at dø for en løgn? Og at verden virker så designet, fra tyngdekraft til menneskehed. Jeg ved, at chancen er lille, en mikroskopisk sandsynlighed. Skulle det hele bare være tilfældigt? Er vi galaksens lottovinder? Eller er der en designer fra havets dyb til bjergets tinder? Hvorfor er der det her i mig, som midt i togen holder fast? Hvorfor ikke bare give slip? Hvorfor ikke nu? Hvorfor ikke i hast? Måske fordi der er en grund til det. Måske er der et formål med uroen. Måske er mit hjerte uroligt, fordi jeg kun finder roen i troen. Måske findes du rent faktisk. Måske er det dig, jeg er skabt til. Måske har du skabt den her længsel, sådan at det er dig, jeg vil. Men er jeg god nok til dig? Når jeg tvivler så meget, som jeg gør, vil du møde mig her i det uklare, når jeg ikke føler, som man bør? Og her i togen ser jeg, at du kommer mig i møde. Ingen løftet pegefinger. Ingen bitre ord, men bløde. Et lille lys slukker du ikke. Et bøjet siv brækker du ikke af. Du ser den lille tro og glæder dig med velbehag. Det afhænger ikke af størrelsen på min tro, men størrelsen på min Gud. Og du fortæller, at det er nok, at du er med i tåge, regn og slud. Der er ingen kærlighed som din, for du elskede selv dine fjender. Du tog en kugle for os og kalder os nu dine venner. Det er dig, der giver evigt liv. Ingen kan rive mig ud af din hånd. Det er ikke mig, der giver mig tro. Nej, du gør det med din ånd. For du har gjort det før, hvor jeg så på troen, og troen svandt. Jeg må se hen imod dig, for jeg så på Jesus, og troen vandt. Og du kan rumme mig, som jeg er, for du siger, jeg har værdi. Selvom du ikke glædes over tvivlen, ved du, jeg snart vil sættes fri. Ja, for til sidst er tvivlen væk. Der skal vi vide alene. Vi vil se dig ind i øjnene. Ikke i tvivl om, hvad vi skal mene.
Store Gud, når jeg dit værk beskuer, naturens rigdom, herlighed og pragt, og stjerners tal på himmelvælvets buer, og alle ting din stærke hånd har skabt. Der bryder lovsang fra mit hjerte. O store Gud, o store Gud. Der bryder lovsang fra mit hjerte. O store Gud, o store Gud. Du plantede selv et træ til korsets planke, og tornekronens busk var skabt af dig. For evighed, det var din store tanke, at du på korset ville frelse mig. Der bryder lovsang fra mit hjerte. O store Gud, o store Gud. Der bryder lovsang fra mit hjerte. O store Gud, o store Gud. Når tidens tåger engang er forsvundet, og vi med skaren rundt om tronen står, vi priser dig for frelsen vi har vundet, hvor lovsang aldrig nogen ende får. Der bryder lovsang fra mit hjerte. O store Gud, o store Gud. sang fra mit hjerte. O store Gud, o store Gud.
Tusind tak til Rasmus Jonstrup for dit spoken word, dit vilde spoken word, Den Lille Tro. Skal vi ikke sige tak til ham? Og tusind tak til Simon Pedersen og hans band for det her skønne musik. Og I kommer selvfølgelig til at høre mere af deres lækre musik i løbet af aftens program. Helt vildt dejligt. Mit navn er Sebastian Vestergaard, og jeg er aftens vært i aften. Jeg vil gerne sige velkommen til alle, der er kommet i aften. Og hey, forresten, er det ikke lidt vildt, at i går aftes fik vi udsolgt 600 billetter til i aften? Er det ikke lidt vildt? Og som I nok bemærkede, da I bookede billetterne, så var de gratis. Ja, og det er der en forklaring til, men den tager vi senere. Og Tobias og jeg, han er ungdomsleder i Skywalk, vi kiggede lidt på hinanden og sagde, hvad skal vi ikke lige streame det her? Så det fik vi lige sat op her i løbet af formiddagen. Så tak til Daniel, som styrer det hernede bagved. Ja. Og min kone derhjemme, hun sidder og ser med, så det var også for dig, vi gjorde det her, skat. Men jeg vil sige velkommen til dig, som er kristen. Og jeg vil også sige velkommen til dig, som ikke ser dig selv som kristen. Måske tilhører du en helt anden tro. Måske ser du dig selv som ateist eller skeptisk over for religion, eller faktisk er åben over for det åndelige osv. Den her aften, uanset hvem du er, den er vores alle sammen. Og jeg håber, at du får en rigtig god aften. Det her event er arrangeret af 2 lokale kristne ungdomsforeninger, som I kan se på slidet heroppe. Skywalk og Unite. Skywalk holder til i Frikirken Randers, som lige om lidt har beliggenhed på Majervej i den her store, flotte kirke, der er ved at blive bygget. Når man kører forbi af Majervej, så kan man jo se den. Den er helt vildt flot, den er ved at blive bygget. Skide godt. Mega fedt. Unite holder til i det gamle ægpakkeri bag Skoda på Grenovvej. Så det er der, hvor vi er. I Kronjyllands frimenighed. Vi er derfor flere og forskellige kristne om i aften. Vi holder sådan et event her i aften, og det kunne man jo spørge, hvorfor holder vi sådan et gratis event for alle mennesker her i Randers og omegn? Og jo, det er et godt spørgsmål. Det er faktisk fordi, vi elsker aftener, hvor du og jeg får mulighed til at forholde os til de store spørgsmål i livet. De spørgsmål, som ikke særlig tit kommer op i vores helt almindelige og fortravlede hverdag. Det er de spørgsmål, vi ønsker at tage op sådan en aften her. Så vi ønsker at gøre det her så tilgængeligt som overhovedet muligt for alle unge mennesker målrettet primært. Men jeg kan se, at der er også andre generationer herinde i aften. Skide godt. Og det er, I er så velkommen. Alle er velkommen her i aften. Derfor har vi taget temaet op for i aften, som er Science, Reason and Faith. Altså videnskab, fornuft og tro. Vi ønsker at stille det spørgsmål, det gode spørgsmål. Er der overhovedet nogen mening for moderne mennesker, der lever i dag, til at tro på noget, ud over det, vi kan se? Derfor ønsker vi at skabe en aften, hvor der bliver rum for, at interessen og samtalerne på kryds og tværs af forskellige trosoverbevisninger bliver skabt. Selvfølgelig er vi interesserede i, vi er jo kristne ungdomsforeninger, vi er jo interesserede i, at flere lærer kristendommen at kende, fordi vi er simpelthen bare forelskede i Jesus. Men vi ønsker, at vi alle sammen er åbne for og respekterer hinandens trosoverbevisninger i aften og generelt i verden. Så vær lige søde ved hinanden generelt, når I møder hinanden på gaden bagefter det her. Det gælder ateister, det gælder folk, der ikke ved, hvad de ser sig selv som endnu. Det gælder folk af anden tro, og det gælder i særdeleshed også os kristne. Men programmet for i aften er, som I kan se på slidet her, den her fine ældre herre, der hedder Alister McGrath. Vi skal have et mega fedt oplæg af professor Alister McGrath om aftens tema Science, Reason and Faith, hvorefter jeg skal have lov til at stille jeres gode spørgsmål til professor Alister McGrath efter pausen i Q&A-sessionen. Og i pausen kan I glæde jer til, ja, er I klar? gratis kagetapas til alle sammen herinde. Ja. Ja. Så vi ønsker jo bare at skabe en mega fed aften, hvor vi kan hygge os sammen. Med gratis, fik jeg sagt gratis? Ja, det fik jeg vist nok sagt. Lækker kagetapas. Så hvis du synes, at i aften det var bare mega kedeligt, så håber jeg det mindste, du kan sige, at der var gratis kage, og der var lækker musik. Yes. Men mere om det senere. Jeg har personligt glædet mig rigtig meget til i aften, for at få besøg af professor Alister McGrath. Og er I klar på, at jeg introducerer ham på sit modersmål, så han forstår, hvad det er, jeg siger om ham? Er I klar på det her, René Randers? Okay, fedt. Therefore, I will switch into English so that Professor Alister McGrath can understand what I am saying about him. I don't know where to start in introducing this well-renowned thinker. Alister McGrath was born in Belfast in Northern Ireland. When he was young, he was an atheist. He started his academic career with a PhD in molecular biophysics from Oxford University. He believed that as science and reason progressed in our society, religion and faith would vanish. What do we have to use religion and faith for? However, Alister McGrath became a Christian himself, which led him to change his career path to research the Christian faith in theology at Oxford University. He received, of course, qualified education. He became a researcher himself, and after many years of hard work and dedication, he eventually was appointed a Doctor of Divinity, which just means the highest degree one can obtain in academia. For many years, he served as a professor of science and religion at Oxford University, where he now has retired. So he has much time for these interesting nights, he has told me. An interesting fact is that many students and faculties of theology and religion over the whole world use McGrath's textbook on Christian theology. The book, which has been published in 6 editions and sold over 300,000 copies worldwide. Yeah, let me say that again, 300,000 copies. That's according to a website. You can ask Alister after the break if you want to know the exact number. I think he knows. However, Professor McGrath's textbook is unique in that way it doesn't reflect his own views. Many people are saying, I don't know what he's meaning. He's presenting these views, but I don't know what he means. Rather, he represents the views and positions of other people fairly and well. But tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we will have the great opportunity and rare opportunity in Denmark to hear this incredible and qualified man, what his opinion is on this relevant question for tonight. Can the modern person believe in God? So, Arena Runners, let us give a warm welcome and a big round of applause for Alister McGrath.
Well, let me begin by saying what a great pleasure and privilege it is to be here. This is a lovely place. I haven't been here before, so thank you very much for asking me. And what I want to do in this talk is to open up with you some of these big questions of life about science, about faith, and about reason. I'm going to tell you about my own story. I'm going to tell you about the things that I find helpful in thinking these things through. And obviously, I hope that these will be helpful to you as well. So I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about myself, just supplementing what you've been told. And then we'll begin to look at some of these very interesting questions. When I was a teenager, which I have to say was quite a long time ago, I was a very aggressive atheist. In fact, when I read Richard Dawkins today, I get very nostalgic because I used to be like that once too. And I took the view that science was able to answer every question and that religious people were, idiots. I mean, they were kind of people who ran away from reality. They didn't really think things through, and it was obvious to any intelligent person that there was no God and there is no need for God. So it just seemed to me this is one of those questions that we don't really need to debate because the answers are obvious. Then, in 1971, I went up to Oxford to study chemistry, again, convinced atheism was right. and began to realize things were not quite as straightforward as I had thought. And I had to go through a major rethink. I want to try and explain some of these issues that really began to open up. The first of them was this, that although I was studying chemistry at Oxford, I met lots of intelligent students, and I began to realize a number of things. Here's the first of them. I began to realize I had not understood what Christianity was. I had thought that Christianity was believing some slightly strange ideas which clearly made no difference to life at all. Whereas my Christian friends at Oxford were talking about something very different. They were talking about a way of looking at the world, a way of understanding human existence, which was transformative, exciting. And I hadn't come across this way of thinking before. So I began to realize maybe I've got this wrong and need to do some rethinking. For example, I thought faith was simply saying, yes, there is a God. I hadn't realized it was about realizing I have found something that is stable and meaningful and relevant and transformative, which gives me a reason to hope and a reason to live. Because that really is what faith is all about. So I had a lot of learning to do about what Christianity was. And as I was beginning to learn about what Christianity was, I was also beginning to think about atheism and beginning to realize that perhaps things were not quite as simple as I had thought. I began to realize that atheism actually had a lot of difficulties about it. One of them, which I'm going to talk about later a little bit more, is this. Christians believe that there is a God. Most atheists believe that there is no God. But actually, both of those positions are faith positions. You cannot prove either of them. And initially, I took the view you should only believe things that could be absolutely proved to be true. But as you're going to see shortly, that actually is a very difficult position to sustain. And of course, I also discovered writers who really helped me. And I mentioned C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis and I were both born in the city of Belfast. We both discovered Christianity at Oxford University. And I found Lewis an enormous help in beginning to think things through. So let's begin to think about one question, which I think many of you will want me to talk about, and which indeed was a very important question for me as I was a teenager and as I later went up to Oxford to think about these things. And it's this idea that maybe belief in God is what Sigmund Freud calls a wish fulfillment. What do we mean by that? Well, really we mean something very simple. We mean that we want there to be a God, so we invent God. And therefore, God isn't really there, but our need, our desire for God is there. And therefore, we invent God to correspond to this need. And that seemed to me to be a very powerful argument against Christianity. And psychologists do tell us that we are very often influenced by our desires without actually realizing it. But one of the things I began to realize was this isn't just something that applies to Christianity. It applies to atheism as well. Because I look back on my teenage atheism, I began to realize that maybe I was an atheist because I wanted total autonomy. I didn't want someone else to say, you ought to be doing this. I wanted to exercise my right to do whatever I pleased. In other words, I did not want there to be a God, and I therefore latched onto or began to take seriously arguments against God's existence. But I've mentioned here the atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel, who many of you may have come across. He's very well regarded, and he's very clear about why he was an atheist. I'm going to read this out to you. And as I read it, I'd like you to notice the importance of desire. Here is the way I'd like the universe to be, and therefore I'm going to make it like this by adjusting my beliefs accordingly. It isn't just that I don't believe in God naturally, hope I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. I think that is an important point because it does suggest, I think you'll agree, that there is a real issue that what we would like the world to be like shapes our ideas. In other words, the desires come first, and then we give the reasons for thinking we're right afterwards. But obviously, many of you here tonight will have heard of the debates that arose from the New Atheism. Now, the New Atheism really began back in 2006 with people like Richard Dawkins and later Christopher Hitchens, and this was seen by many people as marking a radical new change in Western culture, a time when religion would simply be discarded, disregarded. In effect, it was no longer meaningful and could not be taken seriously by any thinking purpose. And this was very influential, and I found myself becoming quite heavily involved in some of these debates. And one of the questions that really became very important in those debates was the question of whether science and religion are incompatible. Because when I was an atheist myself as a teenager, I believed in what is sometimes called the warfare model. Again, the warfare model of the relation between science and religion. I don't know where I got that from. All the textbooks I read said it was right, so I bought into it. But actually it is historically very dubious. The warfare model says science and religion are incompatible and they are at war with each other. And that certainly was very influential because I loved science, as I'm sure many of you here tonight do as well. And it therefore seemed to me that almost as a matter of principle, I just couldn't have anything to do with religion. And that was very influential for me. Then I went to Oxford and began to study leading scientific theorists, including Albert Einstein. And Einstein took a very different position. Let me tell you what Einstein said. Einstein said, look, science, religion, ethics, and politics, they're all different. But the fact that they are different doesn't make them incompatible. It just means that we use different ways of thinking in deciding what is good, what's politically appropriate, is there a God, what does God want of me, and how does the world function? In other words, Einstein was very clear that these are different, they're all important, but they don't actually contradict each other. They're simply different aspects of human life, and to live meaningfully, we're going to have to think about science and religion and ethics and politics. But that does not mean that taking ethics seriously means you can't be a scientist. It just means that you use different ways of thinking to begin to resolve these questions. Now, as I'm sure you know, Einstein was very concerned about scientists being moral people. And the reason for this, of course, was the development of the atom bomb during the Second World War. And Einstein's theories about the equivalence of matter and energy were a major contribution to the development of nuclear technology. But Einstein was adamant. He was absolutely clear. We need scientists who are ethical people. But he was equally clear to be an ethical person and to be a scientist. Although science and ethics are different, there is no reason at all why a scientific person should not be an ethical person. Yes, they use different methods, but they can come together and help us to be ethical people. I'm sure there are many of you here at high school or university who in effect can see the importance of this point. And Einstein, I think, was saying something really significant here. But there's another matter that I want to begin to talk about. And this is the deeper questions of life. Karl Popper, the well-known philosopher, used the phrase ultimate questions. Again, ultimate questions, to talk about the questions of life which really matter. They speak to us about good and evil. They speak to us about meaning in life. In other words, these are questions which really go to the heart of the question, what does it mean to be a human being, and what difference does it make the way I think about these very deep questions? And the basic theme you will find in writers like Einstein and many others is this. Science is wonderful at helping us to understand how this universe functions. And that's really important. But we do need more than that as human beings. And people will therefore argue that we need something deeper. We need to understand what our universe means. We need to understand what we mean. We need to understand what it means to live a good life. And science doesn't really help us very much in that. But that is no criticism of science. Science is science. It doesn't do morality. That's something we bring in. And one of the points I'm going to make is we need to find a way, in my view, to hold together our love of science, our interest in ethics, how do I become a good person, our interest in this deep philosophical or religious question, what is this world all about, and what is my life all about? And use all of these like different lenses to look at our world and be able to see it in a richer and deeper way. So that seems to me to be really quite an important point. Richard Dawkins argues that we ought to be able to prove all of our beliefs. And if you can't prove them, you shouldn't hold them. And I want to say I agree with Dawkins. If possible, we really ought to be able to prove our beliefs. But the real difficulty is that beliefs about ultimate questions really lie beyond proof. And if Dawkins is to be consistent here, he's going to have to say we can't really reach secure understanding of what is good, what is the meaning of life, is there a God, is there not a God, because the evidence is not able to prove these. Now, I think this is quite an important point. I'm going to suggest to you that in this life we have to live with a degree of uncertainty. That the really important beliefs in life are things we can't absolutely prove are right, even though there are things that we feel we can trust. So let me try and think this through with you and see what you think about this. What beliefs can we prove? Well, I think you can prove that 2 and 2 make 4. I also think, sadly, that we can prove that Queen Elizabeth II of Britain died in September 2022. We miss her enormously, I have to say. And we could prove, I think, this, that the chemical formula for water is H2O. So those, I think, are safe beliefs. But I want to just ask you this question. Would these beliefs give you a reason to get up in the morning? Would they, in effect, say, that helps me work out who I really am. It helps me work out the meaning of life, what my purpose is. You see, the answer is no. To do that kind of thing, we need to go much deeper. So let's just keep thinking like this and see where we go. I'm asking you now this question. What beliefs can we not prove? What beliefs can we not prove? In other words, if Richard Dawkins' world is a world of certain things that we can prove, what beliefs are not allowed in that world? Well, basically, I think the answer is quite simple. Any ethical idea. You can say, I believe it is right to do this, but you won't be able to prove it. Or again, think of your politics. You've thought these things through, you've arrived at conclusions, and you feel good about these things. But if someone were to say to you, prove that you are right, it would be difficult. And that's something I'm going to come back to shortly, because it is really a very important point. I'm going to talk to you about Sir Isaiah Berlin. He's an Oxford scholar, he was a leading philosopher of his day, and he gave enormous thought to human beliefs. And he argued that human beliefs fall under 3 broad categories. Let me see if you think he's right. First of all, those that can be established by empirical observation. In other words, you look at the world and you say, I think we can in effect say these things are things we observe, and therefore we try to understand what they mean. Secondly, he talks about those that are established by logical deduction. For example, the whole, W-H-O-L-E, is greater than the part. And then there was a third category, a category of beliefs that could not be proved in either of these ways. And Berlin is simply speaking as a critical philosopher, and says, if we look at our beliefs about politics or ethics or identity or religion, all of these belong in that third category. They just can't be proved. So what do you think we should do? Should we all go, oh no, we can't live meaningfully in this world because we can't prove the things that really matter? Well, Berlin is really just saying, get used to this. This is the way things are. You can prove shallow beliefs, 2 and 2 make 4, but a really deep belief, like torture is wrong, that is something that goes way beyond proof. It's something deeper. And the point I'm going to make to you is simply that shallow beliefs are fine, and we use them quite a lot. But all of us are looking for those deeper truths that help us to become good people, to live meaningful lives. And what you will find is we just can't prove these. But it does mean we can give good reasons for saying, I think this is right, I'm going to, in effect, do this. But we just have to realize we can't prove that these things are true. And once you begin to see things in this way, things do get much more interesting. Now, this is Alex Rosenberg, who's an atheist philosopher, and he adopts a position which would sometimes be called scientism. I'll say that word again, scientism. It's not a nice word. Scientism means believing that only the natural sciences can answer all of our questions. So Rosenberg, in his Atheist Guide to Reality, which came out about 10 or 11 years ago, says, let me give you simple, certain answers to some of life's big questions, based on science which is completely reliable. Let me use this tool to answer all of life's questions. Question number 1, is there a God? No. Okay, next question. What is the nature of reality? Well, what physics says it is. Bit limiting that. Next, what is the purpose of the universe? There is none. Next, what's the meaning of life? Ditto, the same thing. But listen to this one. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? Now, for me, that is a really big question, and I'm sure you will also feel this is a very significant question. Look at Rosenberg's answer. There is no moral difference between them. Now, when you look at it more closely, what Rosenberg is saying, if you use science as your only tool for answering life's big questions, then there is no moral difference between good and evil. What I would say is simply, Rosenberg's argument shows us that we really need to use more methods to be able to answer these questions. If science can't answer these, we say, well, look, science is science. Let's begin to do some moral philosophy, or let's look at Christian ethics or something like that, and see how these help us to answer these questions. But let me press Rosenberg quite hard here, because many of Rosenberg's colleagues are deeply concerned about that last statement. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. But when I look at our world, I see things going on that I would want to say are evil. And it's absolutely essential to say these things are evil. They should be stopped. We should be doing something about wars. We should be doing something about famine. We should be doing something about, well, all those things that really energize us and make us feel things are going wrong and something needs to be done. And my point is that I don't think Rosenberg could live with that philosophy of life, because these ideas of evil and good are so important. You know, I remember watching the movie Schindler's List, and maybe some of you have as well. It was quite shocking, and it really brought home to me how significant evil is. And that seems to me to be a real problem here with what Rosenberg is proposing. So Rosenberg is basically saying science is our exclusive guide to reality, and maybe it is, except that position turns out to be intellectually circular. And Rosenberg himself admits that this is the case. It's a viciously circular argument. Why is that? Well, because if you want to defend the idea that only science can answer our important questions, then in effect you presuppose that it's right. Because if you're saying science is the only way of answering big questions, then the question, is science the only way of answering life's big questions, can only be answered scientifically. So there is a circularity there, which is really disturbing. So I think is something very important. I want to move on now and talk about faith being reasonable. The point I've just made in the previous section is simply this: we need more than science is able to give us to live meaningful lives. That is no criticism of science. It's just saying we need more than that. I got through the COVID outbreak without becoming infected, but what I did a lot of the time was to take my temperature just to make sure everything was okay. And you know, my thermometer was wonderful. Every time I checked my temperature, I was okay. Now listen, supposing I were to say this to you: because the thermometer is such a wonderful tool when it comes to dealing with temperatures, I could use it to answer every question. I think you would say, Alister, you're mad. and you might be right. Because in fact what you are saying is, because a tool works well in one area of life, we can use it for everything. Well, no, it's not like that. I think that's really important. Life is complicated. We need different methods, different ways of thinking to engage with all these different questions. And that's why I think I'm worried about Rosenberg's approach. Let's go back to Richard Dawkins and C.S. Lewis and just play around with them a bit. Dawkins argues you should only believe what can be proved by reason or science. C.S. Lewis takes a position quite similar to what I've been arguing myself, that most of the important things in life lie beyond rational or scientific proof. And that's not something you need to worry about. It's just the way things are. A deep belief helps you understand who you are, gives you meaning, gives you significance. You can't prove it precisely because it is such a big question. But we need these kind of answers if we're going to lead meaningful life. Dawkins himself talks about faith in terms of blind trust in the absence of evidence, even in the teeth of the evidence, and often speaks of faith as being a kind of mental illness. I think that's going over the top a bit, I have to say. But basically what I want to say to you is that very often faith is just something we have to get used to. If you were to say to me, Alister, be very, very honest, tell us what the meaning of life is, I would say to you, I believe that. And in saying that, I'm just being absolutely honest. Richard Dawkins has views on the meaning of life as well. He simply tells us the meaning of life is this, nothing really. But he doesn't make it clear. These are not proved conclusions. They're simply the way he thinks. And that to me is a really important point here. And it is very, very significant, I think, in thinking about these questions. So let's move on from that because it's not that interesting. I'm going to just make the point that Richard Dawkins takes a very characteristic New Atheist attitude, saying what you see is what you get. Reality is limited to what reason and science can prove. But I want to suggest to you it's not that simple. One of the things I've learnt over my life is that very often if something is presented as very simple, there's probably something wrong with it. Because in many ways, the big questions of life are complicated. And we have to try and work out how they function in a deep way. And as you will all know, science very often looks at the evidence and says, well, there are several possible conclusions here. Those of you who are into quantum theory in its various forms will know that there are 3 or 4 understandings of quantum theory. They're empirically equivalent. That means you can't do an experiment to sort them out. And really the point I want to make is that in real life, proof is limited to the worlds of logic and mathematics. 2 wonderful worlds, but for deep decisions. What should I do with my life? How can I become a good person? How should I behave in this complex world? You need a lot more than that. And so the question is, where do you get these moral frameworks from? And one answer simply is you get from philosophy, or of course, you can get it from religion, which have deeply thoughtful ways of thinking about this, tried and tested over a very long period. And of course, the other thing to say about science is it does change its mind about things. Let me just give you one example and follow through on why this is so interesting. We're looking at cosmology. I want you to do a mental experiment. We are stepping back 100 years. It is 1923. What was the prevailing scientific consensus about the origins of the universe? Well, quite simply, the prevailing scientific consensus at that time was that the world, the universe, has always been here. Because the exciting evidence that the universe was expanding and hence seemed to have an origin really began to emerge in the late 1920s and, of course, was consolidated after the First World War. Science does change its mind. I want to make the point that moving from saying the universe has always been here to the universe came into existence is actually a very big step. Back in the 1920s, the religious idea of creation was seen as, just incredible nonsense. Today, it has to be taken a lot more seriously because science has moved on. And I think that's a very important point. In 1948, we had a very famous debate between the atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell and the Catholic philosopher Frederick Coplestone about big questions, the kind of questions I've begun to open up with you tonight. Is there a need for God to believe in morality? Do we need to explain why the universe is there? Coplestone won that first question, in effect saying we need a transcendent reality to give us stable moral values. But Bertrand Russell won the other debate because he said, look, the universe has always been here. Therefore, it doesn't need to be explained. You will not be surprised to know that when this debate was replayed 50 years later, on that second point, the debate went in quite the opposite direction. Because if the universe came into existence, then clearly things are very, very different. In fact, William Lane Craig debated Anthony Flew, who actually began to believe in God in a rather weak way, I have to say, as a result of that debate. Now, clearly, there's a lot more I could say. Let me talk briefly about C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist who became a Christian. I'm going to talk about him because I have talked quite a bit about science, and I do want to make it clear that there is a lot more than science, even though I think science is really interesting. Lewis was initially an atheist, and there are 3 main reasons for this. One was that he found suffering to be a real problem, didn't believe there could be a God because of suffering. And of course, Lewis was a soldier in the British Army during the First World War who was badly injured. He was angry with God for that. He also, in effect, believed that science simply had made belief in God impossible. Science and religion were incompatible. That's what people thought back then. We don't think that anymore. But Lewis began to realize that atheism didn't really give him a secure place of habitation. And his reason for doing this is not to do with science. It's to do with his feeling that atheism creates an imaginatively restricted world, that it's not really the kind of world that a thinking person could inhabit. Let me read this to you. This is from his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. So that's Lewis just helping us to see. He was saying, this world might be right, but it's not very interesting. It doesn't really help me to live as a human being. So I think that's a very important point. And Lewis came to see Christianity as a big picture which gave stability and depth to his thinking about ethics, morality, meaning, and all these things. And that question of meaning has become a lot more important in recent years. What does meaning mean? Well, one of the big themes here is feeling that you are part of something that is bigger, that your own life is given significance by being part of something that is larger than yourself, being connected to these bigger things. And that is a very important idea. And Lewis felt that he needed this way of thinking about Christianity to really do this. And he wrote these words, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Now, I'm beginning to run out of time, and what I've been trying to do with you is simply explore some big questions. What I want to say to you is that I'm an atheist who became a Christian, but I'm not an arrogant Christian. This works for me, I think it's right, and I debate regularly with atheists on these themes. But the point I would make with you is these are deep questions, and they're difficult to think through. And so I want to, again, just reiterate the point. Dawkins is right when he says we need to provide reasons for our belief. But he's wrong to think we can prove everything we believe. And Bertrand Russell, who's self-described as an atheist, wrote these words in his History of Western Philosophy. Philosophy helps us to live without certainty. In other words, it says, look, you can cope with this. It's a theme we find in the New Testament. Think of Paul's first letter to Corinthians. We see through a glass darkly. Things aren't as sharply in focus as we'd like them to be, but we still see enough to help us make sense of things, even though we know we can't absolutely prove them. We have a sense this is right, and we can therefore hold on to these beliefs. Some of you will say, well, look, you said Russell is an atheist. How can he be an atheist if he's saying we have to learn to live without certainty? The answer is Russell knew you can't prove there is a God, you can't prove there is not a God. Russell chose to live his life on the basis of the belief that there is no God. So he's actually being very honest about what he's doing. So I'm now going to look at Jonathan Sacks, and then I'm going to move on and conclude what I'm going to say. Jonathan Sacks is a very well-known Jewish writer. He died recently, unfortunately, but he was very much respected in England. And this is Sacks just saying, look, let's be honest about this. There are limits to what we can prove. We cannot prove that life is meaningful and that God exists. But neither can we prove that love is better than hate, altruism than selfishness, forgiveness than the desire for revenge. Almost none of the truths by which we live are provable. Explanations can be proved, interpretations cannot. Hold on to that sentence. Almost none of the truths by which we live are provable. So I guess my question to myself and to all of us is, what are the truths by which you live, and can you prove that they're right? I don't think you will be able to. But what I think you will be able to do is say, I can't prove them, but I can give you some reasons. Whether you are secular or religious, I think that's the way it is. But I want to move on now and, in effect, just make one more point here. Here we are. This is Frank Rhodes. Frank Rhodes, a very famous geologist, helping us to see how we can give multiple accounts of our world. He asks us to imagine a kettle that is boiling. So do that. Imagine a kettle that's boiling. Rhodes' question: why is the kettle boiling? One answer, scientific answer: because of energy conversion. The electricity goes through the heating element, heats it up, and as a result, the kettle boils. Rhodes is saying that's right. But he also says there's another reason the kettle is boiling. Rhodes was British. He wanted to make himself a cup of tea. Now, just think about this. What is the tea answer incompatible with the energy conversion answer? No, they are different aspects of a big picture which lets you see things in greater depth. And that, I think, is a very important point to make. For me, science and religion give us different lenses, which means we see things stereoscopically, deeper. How the universe functions is very important, but also how, well, what we actually mean. And that helps us live out our lives in hope and hopefully in good relationships as we go ahead. But I'm going to move on to one final nearly there. There we are, look at that. This is the book, and it's a teasing book. It's a group of 12 people who have written memoirs of a discovery. They were all people who were deeply influenced by reading Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And these are narratives of people saying, we thought everything was straightforward, very simple, Dawkins was right. And then as we began to read him in more detail, we began to realize he had extended way beyond the limits of proof and evidence. He was giving us opinions rather than facts. And in effect, it's the story of a group of people saying, we ended up feeling we had to move away from him and embrace Christianity instead. Now I'm bringing this lecture to an end. Thank you so much for listening to me, but here's the point I want to make. I've just been exploring these issues with you. I haven't resolved them. What I hope I've persuaded you of are two things. Number one, these things are complicated. Number two, they are really interesting. And the main point I want you to take away tonight is actually we do live in a world where we can't prove everything that really matters. But that, I think, is something we can live with. And it means that we need to be able to say there are good reasons for what we think are right, but we know we can't prove them. And that gives us a reason to live and a reason to think and to hope. And I imagine I'll explore these further in dialogue with you, either directly or indirectly through questions. But let me thank you so much for listening. It's been such a privilege to be able to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Alister. I'm looking forward to our Q&A session after the break. Der vil nu være en kort pause med mulighed for flere ting. Så hæng lige i, før jeg sender jer ud. Og vær søde og sidde på jeres pladser, før pausen slutter. Det kunne være mega fedt, fordi vi er så mange, det går helt derned. Det er virkelig, virkelig fedt. Så pausen slutter 15 over, så vær der gerne 13 over. I hvert fald. Arena Randers' køkken, mega dejligt, skønne mennesker, de har nu serveret lækker og gratis kagetapas. Fik jeg sagt gratis kagetapas tidligere? Det tror jeg nok, jeg fik. Og der vil være en vand til alle herinde. Og vi er helt vildt glade for den ekstraordinære opmærksomhed, som det her event har fået. Derfor havde vi den vilde idé, at vi åbnede for 100 pladser mere. Og det betyder altså, at vi ikke havde forventet, at der skulle være 600 billetter, der blev booket. Det blev der så. Vi havde oprindeligt tænkt, at der skulle være 500. Så når I går ud til kagetapassen, det er et fedt ord, ikke? Så vær lige forsigtig. Gå lige forsigtigt til at tage en lille smule. Så det bliver til glæde og gavn for alle. Ikke? Vi skal prøve at praktisere den her næste kærlighed. Vi skal tænke på hinanden, før vi tænker på os selv. Yes. Simon Pedersens trio vil jam for os i pausen. De dygtige musikere fra Aarhus Musikkonservatorium, så nyd det. Derudover så er der mulighed for at tale med Rasmus Jonstrup, som holdt sit spoken word, den lille tro for os. Så smut forbi hans stand med lykkehjulet og vind en lille gave, og tal med ham om tro, teologi og Maja Højskole, hvor han er lærer og egentlig også Ph.D.-studerende. Så vil der være et bogsalg, og hvis du er interesseret i at dykke ned i tanker om tro, videnskab og håb osv., så har vi et bogsalg af ProRex forlag, som nu vil sælge spændende bøger og litteratur, der relaterer sig til aftens tema. Blandt andet af både McGraths og min yndlingsforfatter, C.S. Lewis. Og i aften er der ekstraordinær rabat på 50 kroner. Helt vildt. På alle C.S. Lewis oversættelser. De er kommet i en ny oversættelse, så det skulle være på mundret dansk. Jeg kan særligt anbefale Fælles kristendom af ham. Yes, den er helt vildt god. Og der er selvfølgelig mulighed for at købe noget lækkert drikke med mere i caféen. Og apropos caféen, så hvis vi har Heidi, en sød kollega herude, og vi har Simon, som render rundt et sted, de tager nogle rigtig dejlige billeder af os i aften. Og hvis I ikke kunne tænke jer at være på et, når de render rundt i caféen og tager nogle fine billeder, så bare lige sige det til dem. Det er helt okay, hvis du har en grund til det. Udover det, så vil vi sætte pris på, hvis vi lige giver Alister McGrath en pause. Altså at vi ikke lige går op til ham og kommer 500 mennesker op og vil gerne stille spørgsmål til ham. Det gør vi efter eventet. Yes, han vil være her. Men i hvert fald tænk gerne over, hvad I godt kunne tænke jer at stille spørgsmål til Alister McGrath. Der kommer et telefonnummer her efter pausen, som I kan skrive jeres spørgsmål ind til, hvor vi så vil stille ham de spørgsmål. Så sid her gerne. Okay, vi trækker den til 16 år. Sid herinde 16 år, fordi vi starter 20 år. Let's go. Vi ses.
Altså, vi hygger bare rundt i de her træ, og gentager nogle ting, og så ser vi. Jeg tror simpelthen, jeg havde simpelthen ikke noget bas, og den var bare forsvundet fra min hånd. Olli, bare kom herover. Du prøver? Ja.
Ja, jeg håber, at I alle sammen har haft en rigtig god pause med nogle lækkerier fra Arena Randers' køkken. Det er helt vildt lækkert, og I kommer til at høre senere. Det er en lille teaser, men I får at vide, hvorfor det var gratis senere. I hvert fald, måske har I overvejet, hvad I kunne tænke jer at spørge om. Det håber jeg, I har gjort, og ellers så vil der ligesom blive mulighed for det nu. Nummeret står lige heroppe. 42 19 70 48. Og de kan se det på skærmen rundt om i hele salen. Det er en rimelig fed sal, vi er kommet ind i. Skriv gerne kort og præcis, helst på engelsk, ellers så får vores Q&A-team travlt med at oversætte og med at gøre det koncis. Udover det, så vil jeg gerne understrege, at vi udelukkende kommer til at forholde os til emnet, eller emner, der relaterer sig til science, reason and faith. Yes. Og det har Alister McGrath sagt, at det er fordi han er professor, og det er ret professoragtigt at sige, jeg ved ikke så meget andet, end om det, jeg har forsket i inden for det. Så det er en sådan professor-ting. So, Alister, thank you so much for giving that lecture. It was really exciting and incredible to listen to your story, which also matches up with C.S. Lewis' story a lot. Born in Belfast, started young as an atheist, became a researcher and scientist. Well, he was in humanities, of course, but and then converted to Christianity as well. It was really incredible, from going from atheism to Christianity. So my first question for you today is, how do you like it in Denmark?
Well, I hope you will ask me back again, because I really like Danish people, and the landscapes here are just wonderful, so thank you for that.
Yeah, when we drove on the highway, you could view the whole, yes, it was very beautiful. Okay, Alister, you believe that all people, regardless of what they have as their faith, we all need meaning, faith, and values. And it's something we can't avoid in our lives, as you mentioned in your lecture. Christianity also generates meaning in Christians' lives. But what makes Christianity true as opposed to all the other religions or faiths? Could you try to elaborate on that?
Well, I think this is a very good question. So let me just try and open up some of its elements. One is that none of us wants to believe something that we know to be false. I think that's very, very clear. That we want that whatever we mean by true, it is something that we feel we can accept. So I think that is really something that's very significant. I remember once I was having an argument with a friend of mine in Northern Ireland who was a politician. And I said to him, look, that is so mad, you just can't believe it. It was an idea he had about politics. And I asked him how on earth he could hold on to this ridiculous belief. And he looked at me and he said, practice, dear boy. But I think that the key thing here is that one of the things we have to say is that we're not just saying, look, we accept this. We need some reason to think this is right. And I think that that's important for us, because nobody's going to want to embrace something when they think it's wrong. You know, there has to be something about it. So that's the first thing I want to say. But truth is about more than just being able to say there are good reasons thinking this is right. Because truth actually, and here, you know, you have a Danish philosopher, Kierkegaard, who does talk about this quite a lot. Truth is something which has to really speak to us deeply and inwardly as well. In other words, this is about not simply a truth that nourishes the mind, but also something that speaks to the heart as well. I think that is extremely important, because it's saying that it's not just saying here is something that you can accept that's right, like 2 and 2 make 4. It's very much saying here is something that you can trust, and it gives you a reason to live and a reason to hope. It gives you a moral framework to live by. And we need all of these things. And that for me is why when I talk about Christianity being true, I'm not just saying that it's factually right. I'm saying it can be trusted. It works at a deeper level. So in effect, this is a philosophy of life. This is something which really is able to give you something that you can live out in the world, rather than just a kind of private philosophy which may answer some questions, but not all.
Okay, But there's come a question from an atheist who thinks that, okay, Alister, of course we can't prove everything, but you're saying that we need faith to live out our lives, and you're saying it gives meaning, but many things gives meaning.
Well, many things might give meaning, but on the other hand, we have to make a choice. And the point I would want to make against that very good comment from an atheist would be, I need to have a criterion for choosing. And it has to be something that is not simply something we've invented. It has to be something real. And for me, that is a very important point to make about how we choose what we think is right. It's not just, this will help me get a job, or this will do this or that. It's very much this I believe to be something that is right and relevant and transformative, but I have to then be very honest and say that given the complexity of life and given the limitation of human beings, we have to recognize we are not going to be able to prove that this is right. But I want to make that comment against my atheist colleague as well, because my argument would be that if you buy into atheism, you are actually going beyond what the evidence allows you to say. I don't mind you saying, I think that Christianity might be difficult to prove, or something like that. That I think is a fair point. But if you're saying my view is right, then I'm going to say, on the basis of what evidence can you make that judgment?
So what you're promoting is an evidence-based faith.
It's an evidence-based faith which recognizes the limits of the situation. In other words, that evidence is able to prove some things to be true, and I welcome that, it's very important. But when we look at these really deep questions which are essential to being a human being, you find that actually the evidence doesn't really deliver the quality of an answer you're looking for. So you might just say, right, I give up. I do not discuss meaning or morals. Those are things I just can't comment on. Or you say, look, I'm a human being. I have to work on the basis of a moral system. I've got to do the best I can and trust it's right. And that really, I think, is a completely defensible viewpoint. Some of you in this audience tonight may have read William James, and you'll know the kind of reasons that William James gives for that perspective. Okay.
Interesting. So you don't want to end up with a kind of relativism that anything goes with your view on evidence-based faith?
No, I don't want to go with anything goes. I want to be respectful, trying to understand why people disagree with me. But I do want to, in effect, say, I think it's reasonable to ask, why do you believe that? Can you give me reason for that? And of course, you're welcome to challenge me as well. But I think that the key thing is we need to be respectful. And all my concerns about the new atheism is that it ridiculed people of faith. It didn't just say there is a difficulty in believing there is a God, which is a fair point. What they say is religious people are fools, they are dangerous, they are, they ought to be eliminated from intelligent social conversation.
Oh, yeah.
That's going too far, I think.
Yeah. And I think some people here in this room have experienced that. I don't know if I want to call it arrogance, but it's like, you are a Christian, you must be dumb, you must be stupid.
Yes, and we get this. I call this faith shaming. Where in fact, if you're a religious believer, you're a fool, you're an idiot. Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, I mentioned this book, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. Would you like to guess what one of the reasons for so many people moving away from Dawkins was? Because they felt he was arrogant and simply dismissing people without taking their views seriously. And I do deeply regret that, but it has, I think, backfired on him.
Okay, many questions coming in, trying to elect which one, but I think... okay, so now we've discussed that everybody needs some reasons, we need some evidence to build our faith upon, because not just everything goes. We're not just relativists, like, okay, you believe that, that's good for you. But we're saying, okay, what are the best arguments for you to believe in Christianity? What makes Christianity true? Not just because that's what you always talk about, that it makes sense and it gives you a framework to interpret and to live out life, but what are the reasons for believing that, for example, Jesus rose from the dead?
Well, I will talk about that because it's a very good question. I used to be a scientist, so for me, you are looking for a theory that makes the best sense of the observational evidence. In other words, how can I best make sense of the way things are? And I take that idea and I apply it to religion as well. That actually, you can talk about belief being rational for two different reasons. A belief might be rational because there are good reasons for saying this belief is right, or belief might be rational because if this belief is correct, then suddenly everything else makes sense. That's Isaac Newton. Do you remember the story about Isaac Newton and the apple dropping in his mother's garden? What Newton was saying is, look, if there is this thing called gravity, which I can't prove to be true, but if it is there, that makes sense of that and so many other things as well. Yeah. So it's in effect reasons for, and also the theory being able to make sense of so many things. So in effect, it's both evidence and evidencing. But you would ask me about Christianity. So let me just, if I may, mention some of the things that speak to me very powerfully. When I was younger, I was an atheist, and one of the reasons I was an atheist was this. And this may speak to some people in the audience. I was down here on planet Earth in the midst of space-time. And, well, God was, if there was a God, God was, well, up there somewhere. And, I mean, making no difference to me at all here on planet Earth. And that, for me, was a very significant argument for atheism. And then one of my friends at Oxford explained to me this idea of the incarnation, the idea that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And suddenly I realized, if this was right, and of course that it might not be, but if it was right, then it changed everything, because it meant I was no longer thinking about a distant God, but rather a God who chose to come among us as one of us in order to encounter us and to bring us home. So it's an idea, it's a distinctly Christian idea, and suddenly that really spoke to me very, very powerfully indeed. So that would be, I think, one very significant thing to talk about there.
And then I think I want to jump to another question. Many young people today are struggling with meaning and purpose. We all want to experience satisfaction and joy in our lives, of course. But what do you say to young people who are currently grappling and struggling with the meaning, with the purpose and satisfaction in life in relation to who they are and what they do?
Well, I really would want to say it is very difficult. It's much more difficult than when I was young. And I do want to just begin by saying that things are much more complicated today. And I think one of the things I want to do is to say that one of the things that everyone is looking for, but I think is particularly important for younger people, is a secure base, a sense that they are important, that they are loved, that they are important, and the fact that they are significant, that they are loved, doesn't depend on how many likes you get on social media. I think you need to realize.
Are you sure?
I think we need to say that one of the things that really is quite difficult is people very often rest their self-image on all kinds of external things. And what we need is a system, a way of thinking. Christianity does this. I'm sure there might be others as well. But to say, look, you really do matter. Remember that. You don't need to prove that. You know that. And take that home and kind of please try and think yourself into that situation. Because I talk to a lot of people who are very anxious about this. And my heart goes out to them. It really is a significant problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why, going back to your question about Christianity, this idea that we matter so profoundly to God, despite our imperfections, despite all our weaknesses, all these things are true, and yet we still matter. And we need to hold on to that because it's just so important.
Thank you. Okay, another question is that as a scientist, you said former, but I think when you've written a doctorate in molecular biophysics, you're still a scientist, even though it's many years ago. Christianity includes a lot of elements of the supernatural, and some would say fairy tale-like elements. mythological elements, just like God is speaking, the existence of angels and demons. I was nearly about to say aliens. I wasn't going to say that. That we will get to know. Healings and miracles, and even a story about a donkey speaking. So, you wrote this doctorate, and the question may be, how can you believe that? How can you believe in a religion that implies and has the supernatural elements to it? And therefore, why shouldn't one just reject the supernatural claim that Jesus died and actually rose it again after?
Okay, this is a good question, so I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about it. What do we mean by the word supernatural? What is interesting is that this word did not really begin to appear until about the year 1260 in Latin. And yet people believed in God long, long before that. And it's not really a very helpful word to use. I would rather talk about something that is transcendent. Now let me try and explain what I'm getting at here. What I'm saying is something like this. We need to feel that this world that we inhabit is really important and significant, but it's part of a bigger whole. It doesn't determine everything. There's something beyond it. And one of my atheist friends, who I disagree with occasionally, but he writes beautifully, and he's a very able physicist. This is the physicist Roger Penrose, who you may know won the Nobel Prize for physics or mathematics or cosmology.
I do not know.
No, anyway, he won the Nobel Prize, and I'm sure for very good reasons. But Roger Penrose is a mathematical Platonist. Now, let me tell you what he says, because once you see what Penrose is getting at, it gives you a framework for beginning to answer some of the questions you've mentioned. What Penrose is saying is that this world that we know, the only way to really make sense of it is to say there is another world, a mathematical world, a Platonic world, which is real, which in some way lies behind this world, and we cannot make sense of this world without invoking and recognizing that world. So it's really interesting, because if you're saying religion is about the supernatural, something like that, well, then Penrose would be religious, but he doesn't think of himself as being religious. He sees himself simply as someone who is saying, I am following through on the evidence. And as I interpret the evidence, the best way of making sense of the astonishing mathematics to represent our universe is actually to say there is a real mathematical world out there that we discover and don't invent. So, that you can see there's a real parallel with what Christianity is thinking, which is probably why early Christian writers found Platonism so interesting. But Roger Penrose is just saying, look, we have to think along these lines to make sense of our world. In other words, that invoking a mathematical world or a transcendent world gives us a point of view for making more sense of this world. So that, I think, is a line of thought that's really interesting and worth exploring.
Okay, so you're saying that this world is not a closed system, but there is a world outside.
There's a bigger world outside.
There's a bigger world in mathematics. Is an example of that indicates that. Yeah. And then God should be existing transcendent beyond our world, and then he can get in if he wants to.
Penrose doesn't think there is a God, but he does think there's a mathematical world which actually sometimes comes pretty close to God in the way he uses it. But the point I'm just trying to make is that we need to be aware that saying a closed world system where there's nothing beyond it is actually only one option. And that we really do to think beyond that and think of a bigger possibility than that, which I think means, in effect, we are able to say there is something beyond this world which actually helps us to make sense of this world. And that, I think, is a very interesting starting point for a good discussion.
Yeah, that is actually pretty interesting. Because, it's exciting, right? That this world is not closed like that. Yeah. Okay, many questions on evolution.
Okay.
What's your thoughts on that if you're a Christian?
Well, I mean, I am a Christian and I believe in biological evolution. but I do not take Richard Dawkins' view on biological evolution. Dawkins' view, as I see it, is in effect a metaphysical view that he imposes on it. In other words, it's not a purely scientific way. What he is doing is he's kind of imposing on this a kind of metaphysics of randomness. And I'm not sure that Darwin himself really thought in this way. So if you're asking me what are the options for Christians in relation to evolution, I could give you a number of options. In fact, I will. I'll just say that there are probably four main options you have. There's a position which I take, which I regard as being reasonable, but I don't want to impose this on you. This is something you think through for yourself. I would say that for me, I can accept the idea of biological evolution, and I would look at the early Christian writer Augustine of Hippo, writing in the year 401, who says that God, in effect, brought the world into existence in an instant, and then the world began to unfold and develop. He doesn't use the word evolution, but what he's saying is that the world we now see is not the world as God created it, because it began to develop. The earth brought forth. He interprets that in terms of natural processes. So for me, I as a Christian, am quite happy with that. But others would say, no, there are difficulties there. And they would say that perhaps Christians ought to say something like, we believe in a limited account of evolution, such as what you find in some kinds of intelligent design. Or you might say, look, we need to just say that the world was brought into existence perhaps quite recently, and therefore account for how the evidence for evolution is there, fossils and so on. That would be a young Earth creationism. Or you might, in effect, say we have an option of being an old Earth creationist. And I want to say that none of these views entirely resolves everything. But very often they give you enough to be going on. I told you where I stand, but I don't want to kind of way do your thinking for you. I'm very happy just to leave you to think this one through.
Okay. Yeah, and that's pretty exciting about the perspective you take on all these issues, is that you should be going out for yourself and research these things. But do you just think that we should all just go individually and just think, well, if it's the responsible of the individual to get to a kind of good explanation, what's the community for then?
Well, that is a very good question. Let's talk about that. We mentioned C.S. Lewis a moment ago.
Yeah.
Let's mention him again. C.S. Lewis said that the Christian community is really important in learning about God. What he meant is that ordinary Christians have kind of an accumulated wisdom of thinking about God and living out the Christian life. And so when I'm trying to think something through, for example, now I was transitioning from atheism to Christianity, I didn't really go and read sort of textbooks, and the internet wasn't there to look up. Okay, it was a long time ago. But what I discovered I could do was talk to other Christians, say, what do you think? Can you explain this to me? And actually they did, and sometimes they got a bit wrong, but most of the time they were really helpful. They were saying, here's what we think, and we hope this helps you as well. And I think it's really important that, if you like, the community of faith is a learning community where we share our ideas, we pick up ideas, we test them, and it's all about encouraging each other to grow and helping each other to do this. And I very often think that the community of faith is really like, well, to use a very Christian analogy, a Bible study, where you suddenly realize that somebody has seen something in a passage you've missed. And as they talk about it, you say, my goodness, that I'll go away and think about that, because they've helped me to see that what I think at the moment might need amplification. So I think we need to say that the journey of faith is not a solitary journey. It's a journey we make in company. We can help others, they can help us. And that's such an important part of the understanding of what the community is all about.
Yeah, and that's actually why we invite people to church. Please come, we can learn about God. But C.S. Lewis has a picture in Mere Christianity, Fælles Kristendom, where he says this community idea is like, okay, one person has an experience or an idea about God, and it's like standing in front of an ocean. Can you, okay, so you're watching the ocean, but you cannot say how vast and how, where the lands are and everything. But we need each other to draw a bigger picture of who God is. And that's
Yes.
isn't that one of the ideas you're talking about?
This is right. Lewis develops this idea there, but actually in a later work called An Experiment in Criticism, where what he says is this: my job as a communicator is to help you to see something that I have seen. In other words, I want you to be able to see something that I've discovered and is really exciting and transformative. And the reason that Lewis is so excited is because he will have learned this from somebody else. And what he wants to do is to share it. I will see through the eyes of others. It's a really important thing. And Lewis's point is that this allows you to maintain your individual identity, but you aren't lonely, because there are other people who are helping you to think things through, and you can enrich your thinking with their thinking. And for Lewis, as an Oxford teacher, that's a very important part of his working methodology.
Okay. A lot of questions. So how do you, we can't explain everything, we can't prove everything, but what do you say to moral relativists that say, okay, we can't prove anything, we can't say anything, so what is good, what is wrong?
Well, I think the problem about moral relativism is that it's initially very attractive. It means, in effect, I'll believe what I want to do, and will do it. It's, in effect, if you like, a self-select option, whereby you say, I am going to live out this way of life because it suits me and I like it. And I think that the real difficulty is that one of the very first steps you have to take in developing any moral theory is, I am not on my own. Supposing someone were to develop a moral theory which is entirely self-focused, and they then used it to reference me, you see, I wouldn't be in there. And so what it's trying to say, there has to be a bigger vision of reality, which is not just something I've invented and does not just serve my ends or the ends of the social group I belong to, but which is rooted in something deeper and to which I'm accountable. And at the beginning of Mere Christianity, Lewis talks about this idea quite a lot. And one of the points that I think Lewis really is helping us to see is that we do have this deep sense of justice and morality, which needs to be amplified, of course. But nevertheless, what Lewis is really saying is that we need to be able to find a morality which we believe does justice to us and does justice to everyone else. And for Lewis, the only way of doing this is having a transcendent ground for morality, because otherwise it's simply something that we have invented, very often with our own ends in mind. So if you take, for example, a philosopher who is a pragmatist, they will say, in effect, we just invent these rules. They have no ontological grounding or anything like that. And I think that what I'd want to say is that one of the criteria you can use to judge a moral theory is quite simply, on what are you basing it? What is the ultimate ground of that? And I mean, you know, if you think to Germany just on the eve of the Second World War, there was a resurgence of interest in what's called natural law. And natural law is about some set of moral principles which we didn't invent, but we are accountable to. And the reason that people suddenly got interested in natural law was because of what Hitler was doing. Hitler was rewriting the German legal code so that, in effect, what he thought became law. People said there has to be a way of resisting this. There has to be something beyond this, which allows us to say this is wrong and this is what we really ought to be doing. So in moments of crisis, I think we begin to discover there is something deeper about morality, and we need to find a way of bringing this in.
So it's like having an anchor outside the boat that holds the boat close to the center, that this is right, and if we just say like we don't have a basis to put our ethics on, we go like everywhere without the anchor.
Which is why I'm not a moral relativist. I agree that there is debate about morality, but I think most people are saying we want to find what is right and do it. And using that language of doing what is right immediately says there's something beyond me. I'm accountable to something for the way I think and the way I behave. And that's what I think.
Okay, because I am the host tonight, I get, of course, to choose the last question. Which, of course, is my own. You describe in your speech that you went from turning from one belief to another. To embracing Christianity from atheism, which you called a belief. Maybe there are someone tonight here who thinks, why should I believe in the story of Jesus and his resurrection? But most importantly, if that is correct, if he actually rose from the dead, that something supernatural or transcendent happened, why does it matter in my life that Jesus rose?
Well, let me tell you what I think. It's simply this. I am a human being and I'm going to die. I don't know when, but it's going to happen. What really matters to me, I think, is simply to realize that I have accepted a way of thinking which I believe to be right. It might be wrong, but I believe it to be right. And if it is right, it allows me to die peacefully. It allows me to die meaningfully. And it allows me to say that, in effect, the one who I have come to love, who is Jesus Christ, who gives me a way of living and a way of thinking which I find profoundly satisfying, that it's not as if, when a philosopher dies, you say, well, bye-bye. It's much more, I'm going to be with the one who has energized and guided my life. And that actually makes death completely different. It means, A, you are going home, not going away. And B, also, that you're going to be with the one who actually is the source of everything that matters to me. And so, I may be wrong about this. I want to make it absolutely clear. But this is something that's so important to me that actually really gives my life significance and meaning, especially in what I fear will be its final stages.
Well, thank you so much, Alister. Should we give him a big round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great. Godt. Yderligere vil jeg gerne sige tak til Rasmus Jonstrup for hans spoken word, den lille tro, at det kan se svært ud, men jeg håber, og jeg tror, og jeg møder nogle gange forløsning i min tro. Og tusind tak til Simon Pedersen og hans trio, Jimmy og Olli. Hvor har vi dem? Der, yes. Der skal vi ikke også lige give dem en stor hånd. Så vil jeg gerne sige tak til Arena Randers, for at vi måtte lege loungen her. Jeg tror ikke, der er nogen til stede herinde, så det sagde jeg bare. Så må de se klippet bagefter. Udover det, så skal vi have et slide her. Jeg vil gerne sige tak til de her sponsorer, som har givet penge til det her event. Det er derfor, vi har kunne gøre det gratis for alle, og gøre det så tilgængeligt, så at alle kan være med. Dem, der i hvert fald nåede at booke billet, eller dukket op uden billet, og så viste det sig, at der var plads alligevel. Tak til Cedas, som er et stort internationalt firma, som har beliggenhed her i Randers. Tak til Kombi Industri og AV Pro, som er lokale virksomheder her i Randers, der skaber værdi og gør en forskel her i den her by og andre steder. Så derudover så skal jeg sige tak til nogle fonde. Ja, der er heller ikke nogen repræsenterende her for i aften, men jeg skal bare gøre opmærksom på, at der er de her 2 fonde, som har givet midler til det her event, og det vil heller ikke være muligt uden dem. Vi har Borgfonden, og vi har Dansk Ungdoms Fællesråd. Og derudover så vil jeg gerne sige tak til alle de frivillige. Det her crew, der står bag det her event, vi har simpelthen ikke kunne gøre det. Vi har simpelthen ikke kunne sørge for, at der kom så mange mennesker, som vi kan se her i aften. Altså det er jo helt crazy. Så tak til Skywalk, tak til Tobias Kron for en kæmpe sparringsmarker, hvor du henne sidder dernede. Yes, Tobias Kron, Skywalks ungdomsleder. Og tak til Unites ledelse og alle de frivillige, der har stået sammen om det. Tak for støtte i vores modermenigheder, Kronjyllands Frimenighed, Ægpakkeriet bag Skoda på Grenervej. Og tak til Frikirken Randers, som lige om lidt skal have beliggenhed på Majervej. Yes. Men lige om lidt så kommer Tobias Kron op på scenen. Han skal præsentere en mega fed ungdomskonference, som skal ligge her i oktober i Majer, som vi skal høre mere om. Men inden da, så skal vi lige give et sekund for at teknikken lige kan være klar, så vi bruger lige noget ventetid her på, at de lige er klar. Og så kommer der en video lige om lidt, der skal vise, hvad det er for et mega fedt event, vi skal lige forholde os til.
Kan du også mærke presset? At du skal præstere for at være god nok? Udseende, venner, karakter, karriere, tid. Stress. Kan du få med? Forventninger, pres, angst. At du skal blive til noget stort. At du skal være en succes. Så mange stemmer, der kæmper for din opmærksomhed. En stemme her. 2 stemmer der. Slip.
Lige give den der video en hånd. Woohoo!
Jo, bare gå op nu. Ja.
Sådan der. Så tænker du, det var en mega fed video, men hvad er det dog for noget? Jo, det er Brighter. Prøv lige at sige Brighter.
Brighter.
Yes. Brighter er en tværkirkelig ungdomskonference, der finder sted på Mariager Høj- og Efterskole i efterårsferien fra den 18. til den 21. oktober. Det er for unge mellem 17,5 og 25 år. Er der nogen mellem 17,5 og 25 henne? Er der nogen, der kender nogen mellem 17,5 og 25? Ja, det er godt. Så det er relevant for alle et eller andet sted. Og det er 3 dage fyldt med mega fede ungdomsmøder, hvor vi synger sammen, hvor vi hører relevante, skarpe taler og seminarer. Der er også bare en masse fest og hygge og tid til at være sammen med ens venner. Og alt det der, det kan du få inklusiv kost og logi for kun 650 kroner, og det kan faktisk få endnu billigere nu, hvis man bliver medlem af YFC, som er en organisation, så kan du få det for 4,75. Prøv lige at sige 4,75. Yes. Så om du er kristen og har hørt om det før, eller om du er ikke kristen, men sådan lidt nysgerrig, jeg synes det så egentlig fedt nok ud, så er du bare velkommen til at hive fat i mig bagefter. Jeg vil stå herude i loungeområdet, og så kan du også få tilmeldt dig. Så skynd dig at tilmelde dig ind på Brighters hjemmeside, så ses vi den 18. oktober i Mariager. Woohoo!
Tak for det, Tobias. Godt, vi skal lige have slidet op med arrangørerne. Yes, den er der. Vi har Skywalk og Unite. Vi skal selvfølgelig lige sige lidt om os selv, fordi det kan vi godt lide. Vi har Skywalk, under Frikirken Randers, og vi har Unite. Allerede på onsdag, der mødes vi i Unite i Kronjyllands Frimenighed i Ægpakkeriet på Grenervej til en hyggelig brætspilsaften, som vi kalder for socialaften, med te, kaffe og snakke, hvor vi kan undersøge de her emner, som vi har forholdt os til lidt nærmere. Jeg vil holde en kort tale, det som vi kristne kalder for en andagt, så bare roligt, den er ikke så lang, som det her event har foregået. Så velmødt dertil, hvis man har lyst. Der står adresse her, og man kan følge på Instagram og Facebook. Udover det, så mødes de i Skywalk, det som Tobias Kron, han er leder for, til en aften på torsdag allerede, til Classic Hangout. Ja, fancy navn, jeg ved det godt. Men det er en todelt aften, hvor der vil være en spændende taler, som skal tale om det at være ung med tro. Og aften vil byde på lovsang og kæmpe mega bingo-hygge. Så lad os lige give den op for det. Og det er altså i Frikirken Randers, som på nuværende tidspunkt ligger over for VIA University College på den anden side af vejen. Godt. Og jeg håber selvfølgelig, at I alle sammen har haft en forrygende aften. Den er ikke slut endnu, fordi vi har en time endnu ude i caféområdet, hvor der vil være mulighed for brætspil og snakke. Formålet for i aften var selvfølgelig at skabe interesse for samtale og fordybe sig i det her spørgsmål, som Alister McGrath han lagde op til. Så hvis det skabte interesse, forargelse eller andet inde i dig, så kom og prik os på skulderen og snak videre om det, fordi vi er altså bare almindelige mennesker, der ønsker, at vi skal blive klogere alle sammen. Skriv til en af os ungdomsledere, til Tobias Kron eller til mig, jeg hedder Sebastian Vestergaard, eller en præst i dit sogn. Kom til en gudstjeneste i den menighed, der ligger lokalt hos dig, eller til en ungdomsaften i dit lokalområde. Måske i enten Unite eller Skywalk. Det er henholdsvis hver hverdags, onsdag og torsdag. Og jeg kan i hvert fald bare sige, at jeg tror på Jesus, og det har forvandlet mit liv, og det stadigvæk forvandler mit liv hver dag med håb til livet. Og dørene er altid åbne, og man skal ikke være kristen for at være med. Man kan også bare komme for at hygge sig. Det er helt okay. Og jeg håber, at hvis I har spørgsmål i dag, så bare kom og stil dem. Fordi vi skal ture og tage imod hårde spørgsmål. Men skal vi ikke lige alle sammen rejse os, og så bare synge med på den sidste skønne salme, som Simon Pedersen og den fantastiske trio skal spille for os. Så tusind tak for jer. Skal vi ikke give en kæmpe hånd til Simon Pedersen og deres band.
Alle ting, som Gud har gjort, hans herlighed at prise. Det mindste han har skabt af sted, og kan hans magt bevise. Gik alle konger frem på rad i deres magt og vælde. At sætte på en billede. Det mindste græs jeg undrer på, i skove og i dale. Hvor skulle jeg den visdom få, om det kun var at tale? Hvad skal jeg sige, når jeg ser, at alle skove vrimle, de mange fugle sving der sker op under Herrens himmel? Og hvad skal jeg sige, når jeg går blandt blomsterne i engen? Når fuglesangen sammenslår som 1000 harpestreng. Og hvad skal jeg sige, når mit sind i havets dybe grunde kun dog så lidt kan give ind, og ser så mange munde? Hvad skal jeg sige, når jeg ser, hvor stjerneflokken blinker, hvor milden vejr imod mig lær, og op til himlen vinker? Hvad skal jeg sige, når jeg op til Gud i ånden farer, og ser den store kæmpe trop af blide engleskare? Hvad skal jeg sige, mine ord vil ikke mig sige. Herlig vil være din visdom stor, din godhed, kraft og rige. Opstemmer alle folk på jord i frydetone sang. Halleluja, hvor Gud er stor, og himlen svarer. Tak for i aften.
som jag nynnar på. Ja, mitt liv är en blues som jag nynnar på. Och tonerna målar kärlek